Hello, everybody. This is our first in a series of short presentations in lieu of being able to meet. And by the way, I really miss all of you and I miss our classes. I look forward to the day when we can have them again. But in the meantime, I thought I would do monthly short little lectures on art history topics. Who knows what the topics will be? But I do know this is that in the news lately that I see a lot of people demanding justice. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. And so I want to ask the question, what exactly is justice? And when I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that, a lot of the works that we've seen already in just our first couple presentations have dealt with this issue of justice. Although I didn't really frame it in that way, I think it's going to be interesting to maybe look back and help us ask this question by looking at some of the art that we've already looked at, and in terms of justice. So let's do that, and then we'll look at some art that we haven't seen that deals with justice, and maybe by the end of this presentation, we'll be able to answer this question, or at least ask some follow-up questions that will force us to think about this, I think, more completely. Do you remember, I hope you do, this magnificent Congolese power figure from Central Africa done at the turn of the 20th century, 19th to the 20th century? If you remember, when we were talking about these power figures, we talked about them in terms of being conflict resolution devices, where a leader in the community, a diviner, would hear a conflict between two people, and each person would tell their side of the story. And then, after deliberating with the gods, the diviner would take a nail and have each person drive a nail into the body of this sculpture, wherein the gods would feel the pain of this resolution and remember it. And this was a pretty strong, concept for this particular sculpture. I think it's interesting that when we look at this really is what we're talking about when we talk about conflict resolution, justice as mediation, where there's a conflict, there's a wrongdoing, and a resolution is come by, and to mark that resolution is the nail which causes pain for the deity and remembers this resolution. There's something really sort of meaningful, I think, about justice in terms of conflict resolution and mediation. And I think it can be a useful tool. Now, in terms of recent events, it's interesting that maybe we should look at justice as conflict resolution and mediation. But I don't think that's usually what people think of when they think of justice in terms of what's been happening with the Black Lives Matter issues that have been popping up since last month. Well, let's take a look at another idea of justice. If you remember the Hammurabi Stela, the set of codes that were codified by Hammurabi, who you see, if you remember, receiving these laws from the sun god, and then translated into the monolithic stone pillar. We see a close-up of that here. I want to read to you the preamble to this series of laws. And the preamble says that Hammurabi wanted to make justice visible in the land, to destroy the wicked person and the evildoer, that the strong might not injure the weak. Well, I sort of like that concept. I'm all for the strong and the evildoer not being able to injure or harm the weak. When we read through, however, these set of laws, I'm going to focus on law number 196, which I think you'll recognize immediately. 196 says, if a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. And there you have the sort of biblical sense of an eye for an eye, the tooth for a tooth idea of justice. But before we go on, I just want to read to you another section that follows this. And this section says, and details in more detail, if a man has destroyed the eye of a man of the gentleman class, they shall destroy his eye. However, if he has destroyed the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. But if he has destroyed the eye of a gentleman's slave, he shall pay half the slave's price. Well, clearly here, justice is not equal in the law, but is determined upon one's social class standing. I think there are some who would say, well, what's new? It's the same as it is, as has always ever been. But let's not focus on that cynical, although albeit truthful, spin on that. But let's think about this in terms of a different kind of justice, not one based so much on mediation and conflict resolution, but justice based on retribution, which should act as a deterrence. You have a set of laws that spell out the consequences for inappropriate behavior. That's what an eye for an eye is. And I think there are a lot of people in our culture who would think that this kind of justice, deterrence, and retribution is appropriate. While on the other hand, some will say, well, it's just merely really sort of revenge, isn't it? No matter how you look at it, I think there are some attractive things and some problematic things with retribution and deterrence. I think one interesting way to look at it is through Mahatma Gandhi's eyes, who 3,700 years later said, well, an eye for an eye, and the whole world goes blind. And I think that's, in a sense, what Plato was thinking about when he tackled the idea of justice in his Republic. Now, I'm assuming that you remember us dealing with the Republic in terms of visual art, where in Book 10, Plato launches a pretty vicious attack on the visual arts by using the example of the idea of a bed, where the ideal bed is floating around in the nebulous, and a carpenter tapping into this ideal makes a bed based on truth and reality, where the painter, on the other hand, makes an image of a bed that's thrice removed from reality. And Socrates, through Plato, says that, well, this is what happens in the analogy of the divided line when illusions create beliefs and end in opinions. What we should be really doing is focusing on truth and using logic and reason to gain knowledge to help us understand truth. But that's not really what I want to talk about in terms of art. I want to talk about Plato's idea of what justice is. And he talks about it immediately in the Republic in Book 1, where he asks the question, what is justice? And his students, his sidekicks, bat this idea around. And one of his sidekicks, one of his students, Polemarchus, says, well, justice is giving everybody what they deserve, giving everybody their due, helping one's friends and harming one's enemies. And another student, Thrasymachus, pipes up and says, yeah, justice really is in the interest of the stronger party. A ruler, they get to make justice. They're the ones in charge. And really, you can't really question their authority. So both Polemarchus and Thrasymachus talk about justice as the idea of might makes right. I certainly think Bill Barr would subscribe to this kind of idea of justice. But Socrates says, not so fast. He says, I have a problem with this. And he uses his analogy of a horse in this analogy. He says, well, what if you have a horse and you want the horse to do something like plow a field and the horse isn't cooperating? Well, you could beat the horse and whip it into submission, and finally the horse does what you want it to do. But Plato through Socrates says that's really not what justice should be. And Socrates then says if justice consists of repayment of debts, and that good is the debt in which a man owes his friends and evil is the debt which owes his enemies, then to say this is not wise. Because, and here's the kicker, he says, injuring another can in no case be just. And the reason he comes to this conclusion is because of the ancient Greek ideal of arete. If you remember that, arete is the excellence which every individual has within them that is unique to that individual. They're sort of the best that that individual can be. And Socrates says to harm an individual is actually to detract from one's arete. You can't make someone a better person if you're taking away from their arete, the best that they can possibly be. And from this, we get the idea of restorative justice. And in the contemporary culture, this would include community service and rehabilitation. And that justice can only exist if you rehabilitate the individual. And restorative justice, where both the victims of crime and the perpetrators of crime get what they need to make themselves whole. Well, I have to say at this point, that's sounding pretty good to me. Now, to be fair, I will say, if you read further in the Republic and get into Book 3 and to Book 4 and later, things sort of snowball downhill. And Plato's reasoning gets a little dicey and a little dark. But let's just stop it right here and only pay attention to this idea of justice because I think that it's useful. And there's some comfort in there as well. Let's now take a look at another way to look maybe at justice. And let's fast forward now to the Louvre in Paris. I'm going to take you inside to room number 170. This is the Italian and French 18th century painting wing. And here on a ceiling fresco is a image of justice by Gaetano Gandolfini, the allegory of justice, done about 1760. And this is a familiar view of justice to us. It's Lady Justice holding the scales in one hand and a sword in another, the sword representing the power of justice after judgment is made. And it is an allegory. Now, you all know what an allegory is. An allegory is a story which has a hidden or subliminal meaning. So we get the idea of the story of what justice is based on this image. And like I said, it's one that we are familiar with. We've seen this image or images like it over and over. But what I'm really interested in is, having considered this, asking a question, and that question is, do our experiences and bias have an effect on what our beliefs about justice are? Is justice a absolute that floats around in the nebulous, as Plato suggested, or is it based on really our own biases that are relative to who we are and what our experiences are. And to help illustrate this, let's go into another wing of the Louvre. Let's take a look at the Romantic French painting wing, a beautiful gallery with masterpieces in it. And I want to point one out in particular, and it is Theodore Géricault's The Charging Chasseur of 1812. Well, what do we have here? We have a French Napoleonic general or officer on his steed, rushing into battle that's filled with peril and strife. And this chasseur has valor, and I'm using, as you can tell, very romanticized language, looking at this image and describing what's happening. Now, okay, let's consider something else. Let's consider now a visualization of a phrase. So I'm going to give you a phrase, and I want you, with your eyes closed, to visualize an image that represents this phrase. And the phrase is violent crime. What comes to your mind when you think about violent crime? Now, I'm pretty sure that most Americans, when thinking about visualizing violent crime, do not visualize Theodore Géricault's The Charging Chasseur, a white French guy on a white horse and a very romanticized vision. I would guess that a lot of Americans visualize images like this, because these are the images that they see on the news. These are the images that they read about in papers. And these are the images that have played into the American narrative on what violent crime is, inner city violent crime. And it's because of this that I now want to take a look at the artwork of Kehinde Wiley, who thinks about this kind of idea of our biases when it comes to violence, when it comes to justice. Kehinde Wiley, a young painter who has a very young career, painting magnificent, large works, dealing sometimes with African American portraits in situations that are not typically thought of as being a part of the African American experience. For example, his painting, The Charging Chasseur, done in 2008. It's in a private collection. Well, let's look at this. What do we see? Well, the first thing we see is that the painting is a takeoff on Géricault's romanticized image of an individual creating a violent act. And here we have an individual creating a violent act in an African American experience, but is doing so with the same kind of body language and gesture that we see in the romanticized version. It's foreign to us because we don't really think of an African American in this particular kind of romanticized environment. And that's just the whole point. What Kehinde Wiley is saying is we have a very romanticized and therefore acceptable tolerance of violence in this particular painting, where a Napoleonic soldier is, decapitating and dismembering as they're running through a battle scene. But yet it's presented in a very noble kind of light. And by the way, I would add that Francisco Goya and the Spanish, being on the receiving end of this violence, saw Napoleonic soldiers in a completely opposite light. Here, in a etching from his series, The Horrors of War, we see Napoleonic soldiers actually dismembering a Spanish victim. It's a completely different feeling and idea than the romanticized version of this. And again, that's Kehinde Wiley's whole point, is that our own biases, our own prejudices in terms of the African American experience force us to maybe consider incorrectly the real experience and the truth of African Americans in their environment. I think it's an interesting idea, and it forces us to reconsider what our biases are. So, when we talk about justice, just in the examples that we've talked about so far, whether it's restorative justice and rehabilitation, whether it's justice as retribution and deterrence, or justice as mediation and conflict resolution, or justice that's perhaps clouded with our own experiences and biases. It's a really complex idea, this idea of justice, but nonetheless really important to think about in light of the events that have happened in the last couple months, and in light of the protests that are demanding justice. What does this justice look like? What could it look like? And once again, the history of art helps us with the answer and gives us clues to what the answers could be. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our next venture. Please stay safe and stay healthy.